The words hit her like a slap across the face, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the warmth of the afternoon sun that had been beating down on the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas. "Ask me again when you are ready," Samuel Hadley said, and his voice was low, controlled, devastatingly steady, as though the words cost him nothing when they were costing her everything. Evelyn Barrett stood in the middle of that sun-baked street, her cream blouse already wilting from the July heat of 1882, and she felt the ground shift beneath her boots. She had just told this man that she needed him. She had crossed every line of propriety she had ever known. Every wall she had built around herself since her husband's death had left her stranded in a frontier town with nothing but a boarding house, a mountain of debt, and a reputation for being untouchable. She had looked Samuel Hadley square in the eyes, this impossible, infuriating, devastatingly decent man, and she had told him that she did not want to be alone anymore. And he had said those 6 words as if they were kindness. She wanted to scream. She wanted to press her hands against his chest and push him backwards into the horse trough. She wanted to cry in a way she had not cried since the night Robert Barrett had died with a secret on his lips that destroyed everything she thought she had known about her own life. Instead, Evelyn Barrett lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and walked away from Samuel Hadley with all the dignity she could manufacture on the spot. But she replayed those 6 words the entire walk back to the boarding house. "Ask me again when you are ready." What did that even mean? Was it a dismissal dressed up as patience? Was it a man telling her politely that she had embarrassed herself and that she should go home and reconsider? Or was it something else entirely, something she was too frightened to let herself believe, a door left open rather than one slammed shut? She would not ask him again. She had made that decision before she even reached the porch steps. She broke that decision by the fire that same night. But to understand why she did, and why it mattered more than any single moment in either of their lives, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the day Evelyn Barrett arrived in Caldwell, Kansas with 2 trunks, a forged letter of introduction, and the particular desperation of a woman who had just discovered that the man she mourned was not the man she had married. It was the spring of 1882 March, when the wind still had its teeth and the prairie grass lay flat and brown under a pale sky. Evelyn had come west from Cincinnati, not because she wanted the frontier, but because she had run out of places to go where people did not know her name and what was attached to it. Robert Barrett had been a well-regarded banker in Cincinnati, a man of standing, a man who wore excellent suits and attended the right churches and shook the right hands. He had been dead for 14 months when the letters arrived. Not one letter, 17. 17 letters addressed to Robert Barrett from a man named Vance Cutter, postmarked from various towns across Kansas and Missouri, and every single one of them documented in excruciating detail the business arrangement Robert had maintained with Cutter for 11 years. The arrangement involved land fraud, cattle deed forgeries, and the deliberate financial ruination of small homesteaders who had borrowed from Robert's bank in good faith. Robert had taken their money, their land, and in some cases their entire livelihoods, and he had done it with a smile and a handshake and a suit that cost more than most of those families earned in a year. When the letters surfaced, the scandal was immediate and catastrophic. Robert was dead and could not be prosecuted, which meant the full weight of social destruction landed on Evelyn. She lost the house within 6 weeks. The bank's board seized the assets to cover what could be covered. Former friends crossed streets to avoid walking past her. And then Vance Cutter himself appeared at her door one gray February morning, not to apologize, not to explain, but to inform her that she owed him money. That Robert had borrowed from him personally, in addition to everything else, and that the debt was hers now. Evelyn had looked at Vance Cutter for a long moment, this lean, smiling, dangerous man who spoke in the polished tones of someone who had learned to sound civilized without becoming it, and she had felt something inside herself go very cold and very quiet. She had packed 2 trunks that same week. She had chosen Caldwell, Kansas because it was at the end of the Kishom Trail, which meant it was a town in constant motion, full of drovers and cattle buyers and people passing through who had no particular interest in who she was or where she had come from. She had a modest sum of money, enough to last perhaps 4 months if she was careful, and she had a plan that was thin as paper. Find work, find footing, find a way to build something that could not be taken from her again. The boarding house appeared in her life through what she initially thought was good fortune and later understood was something more complicated. The Caldwell Ladies' Society, a small but determined group of women who had decided the frontier needed civilizing whether it wanted to or not, had a fund for women arriving in difficult circumstances. Their president, a formidable woman named Martha Greer, who was somewhere in her 60s and had the bearing of a retired general, had interviewed Evelyn in the parlor of the society's meeting hall and then made her an offer. The old Hensley boarding house on the south end of Garrison Street had been empty for 2 years since Ida Hensley had died without heirs. The society had been managing it, collecting minimal rent from the 3 long-term tenants who still occupied rooms there, but they wanted someone to actually run it, to cook, to manage, to make it a proper establishment again. The arrangement would give Evelyn room and board in exchange for her labor, plus a small wage that would increase once the boarding house was turned profitable. Evelyn had accepted immediately, because it was either that or sleep in the livery stable. She moved in on a Wednesday. She met Samuel Hadley on the Thursday. He was one of the 3 existing tenants, which meant that the very first morning she was attempting to establish herself as a capable and composed woman of business. She walked into the dining room at 6:30 in the morning carrying a pot of oatmeal and ran directly into a man who was already sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, reading a week-old newspaper as though he owned the entire building. He was tall, she registered that first, tall and broad through the shoulders in the way that men who worked with their bodies tended to be, not the cultivated bulk of someone who exercised for appearance, but the practical, unself-conscious strength of someone who lifted and carried and hauled as a matter of daily necessity. He had dark hair that needed cutting, brown eyes that were currently fixed on her with an expression of mild surprise, and a jaw that was cleanly shaved despite the early hour, which struck her as oddly considerate in a frontier boarding house. "You must be the new woman," he said, folding the newspaper with unhurried precision. "I am the new manager," Evelyn said, setting the oatmeal pot on the sideboard with perhaps slightly more firmness than was necessary. "Evelyn Barrett, and you are Samuel Hadley." He stood when he said it, which surprised her because in her experience frontier men had a complicated relationship with the social niceties that required them to rise when a woman entered a room. Deputy Marshal. She looked at him for a moment. A lawman. Of all the things she needed in her immediate vicinity, a man whose entire professional existence was devoted to uncovering secrets and enforcing consequences was somewhere near the bottom of the list. "How do you take your oatmeal, Deputy Hadley?" she said. "Plain," he said. "Thank you." She served him and retreated to the kitchen, where she stood with her back against the wall and gave herself a stern internal lecture about the importance of being unremarkable. The other 2 tenants were a retired schoolteacher named Gerald Hobbs, who was 73 and almost entirely deaf, and a young man named Pete Dawson who worked at the feed store and was so thoroughly harmless that he seemed apologetic about occupying space. Neither of them posed any particular threat to her composure. Samuel Hadley, she understood almost immediately, was going to be a different matter, not because he was aggressive or intrusive. In fact, he was almost bewilderingly considerate, the kind of man who repaired things without being asked, who brought in extra firewood on cold nights without making a ceremony of it, who thanked her for every meal with a specificity that suggested he actually tasted what he was eating. He paid his rent on time and in full. He was quiet in the evenings and early in the mornings, and he never, in all the weeks she had known him, behaved in any way that gave her concrete cause for complaint. But he noticed things. That was the dangerous part. He noticed everything, with the quiet, systematic attention of someone trained to observe, and increasingly Evelyn had the sensation that he was noticing her specifically, and that his noticing was somehow both more respectful and more unsettling than the open staring she received from half the men in Caldwell who saw a widow of 26 running a boarding house and made their own calculations. The town itself was in the middle of a complicated season. Caldwell was a border town, sitting right on the line between Kansas and Indian Territory, and 1882 was a year of particular tension along that border. The cattle trade that had made the town boom was already beginning to shift, the trails moving, the economics changing, and there were men in Caldwell who had built their prosperity on things that worked better when nobody was paying close attention. The arrival of a deputy marshal who actually enforced laws rather than collecting the salary and looking the other way had made a specific subset of the town's population extremely unhappy. Evelyn had been in Caldwell for 3 weeks when she first understood that Samuel Hadley's life was in ongoing danger. She heard it from Martha Greer, who heard everything, who told her over tea that there had been 2 separate attempts to bribe Deputy Hadley since his arrival, and that both attempts had been refused, which was apparently so unusual in Caldwell that people were still talking about it in tones of genuine bewilderment. Who was doing the bribing? Evelyn asked. Martha Greer set down her teacup with the precision of someone placing a chess piece. A man named Vance Cutter, she said. He operates a cattle brokerage out of the territory, or claims to. What he actually operates is considerably less legitimate. Evelyn felt the room become very still. Vance Cutter, she repeated, and her voice came out perfectly even, which was a minor miracle. You know the name. I may have heard it, Evelyn said carefully, in passing, before I came west. Martha Greer looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who knows she is not being told everything and has decided to allow it for now. Well, she said, he is not a man to make an enemy of lightly. But Deputy Hadley does not appear to be a man who weighs his enemies before he decides what is right. Evelyn thought about this on the walk home. She thought about it while she was making supper. She thought about it while she was serving that supper, watching Samuel Hadley eat in his quiet, steady way, and she felt something cold and complicated working its way through her chest. Vance Cutter was here, in Kansas. The man who had come to her door in Cincinnati and told her she owed him for her dead husband's sins was operating out of the same territory where she had run to disappear. And the man sitting across the table from her, eating her cooking and saying thank you and noticing things, was the lawman who was refusing to be bought off by him. She wanted to tell Samuel Hadley everything. The impulse was so immediate and so strong that it frightened her. She wanted to lay all of it out on the table like evidence. The 17 letters, Robert's fraud, Cutter's claim, her flight from Cincinnati, all of it. She wanted to tell him because he was the kind of man who looked at things clearly, and she had been seeing everything through the fog of her own fear for so long that she could barely remember what clear looked like. She did not tell him. She could not. Because if she told him, he would know who she was and who her husband had been, and the fact that she was running from a man who had an actual financial claim on her presence in this town. And she could not know, not yet, not with certainty, what Samuel Hadley would do with information like that. So she said nothing and carried the secret and went about the business of making the Hensley boarding house into something worth the name. April came, and with it the first cattle drovers of the season, trail-weary and loud, and absolutely desperate for a hot meal and a clean room. Evelyn threw herself into the work with the kind of intensity that left no room for anything else, expanding from 3 tenants to 7, managing a kitchen that ran from before dawn until after dark, scrubbing and mending and calculating and planning with the focused energy of a woman who has decided that work is the only thing standing between herself and the particular darkness that comes from thinking too much about the life you used to have. The boarding house turned profitable in the first week of May. Martha Greer arrived on a Tuesday morning, reviewed the ledger with an expression of barely concealed satisfaction, and increased Evelyn's weight by a third. "You have a talent for this," Martha said, which from Martha Greer was roughly equivalent to a standing ovation from anyone else. "I have a talent for survival," Evelyn said, and meant it more precisely than Martha probably understood. It was Samuel who noticed that she was not sleeping. She had been awake past midnight for the third night running, sitting at the kitchen table with the account books when everyone else in the house was long unconscious. When she heard the creak of a floorboard in the hall and looked up to find him standing in the kitchen doorway in his boots and shirt sleeves, his dark hair still pressed flat on one side from the pillow. "You are going to make yourself sick," he said, without preamble, without the social softening she might have expected. "I have 6 more tenants coming Friday and I need to reorganize the provisioning schedule," she said. "It is 1 in the morning, Mrs. Barrett." "I am aware of the time, Deputy Hadley." He crossed the kitchen, pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He rested his forearms on the table and looked at the open ledger and then at her with an expression that was completely unreadable in the lamp light. "What are you actually afraid of?" he said. The question was so direct, so precisely aimed, that she felt it like a physical impact. She stared at him across the narrow kitchen table and thought, "This man is extraordinarily dangerous and I should absolutely not answer that question." "Failing," she said. "I'm afraid of failing." It was true. It was just not the whole truth. He looked at her for a moment with those quiet brown eyes that never missed anything. "That is a fear worth taking seriously," he said, "but it is not worth killing yourself over, not at 1 in the morning. Is this a professional assessment, Deputy?" Something shifted in his expression, something so small and so brief she might have imagined it. "Consider it a personal one," he said. Then he stood, took the lamp from the center of the table and set it on the shelf where it would be easier for her to reach if she insisted on staying up, and he said good night and went back to his room. Evelyn sat in the dimmer kitchen for a long time after that, her pen held loosely over the ledger, and she thought about the words he had used. A personal one. She thought about the way he had just sat down, without asking, without making it strange, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to keep a woman company in a dark kitchen because she was working too hard. She thought, "I am in serious trouble." May deepened and June arrived with its full heat and the particular ferocity of a Kansas summer that brooked no argument. The cattle trade was thundering, and Caldwell was loud and crowded and full of the specific energy of a town at the height of its season. And Evelyn was so busy that she told herself there was no room in her head for anything but logistics. But Samuel Hadley kept existing in her periphery in the way that particular people do, the way they have of being present even when they are technically somewhere else, occupying space in your thoughts when you are doing something completely unrelated and have not thought about them consciously in hours. She learned things about him in the incremental, sideways manner that cohabitation permits. He had been a marshal's deputy for 4 years, having come to the law from ranching, which explained the hands and the ease with physical work. He was from Texas originally, which he mentioned once in passing and never elaborated on. He read constantly, novels and newspapers and anything else he could find, and he left books in places around the house the way some men left coffee cups, a habit that she found initially irritating and then secretly endearing. He had no family that he mentioned and no particular social life beyond the professional requirements of his work, which gave him an air of self-containment that was either admirable or lonely depending on the day and her mood. He was 29 years old. She knew this because Pete Dawson mentioned it in passing, the way Pete Dawson mentioned most things, which was with the complete innocence of someone who had not considered why the information might be relevant. She was 26. She had been a widow for 14 months and a refugee from her own life for 4. She told herself regularly that none of this was relevant. The situation with Vance Cutter announced itself on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of June in the form of a man she had never seen before who appeared at the front door of the boarding house and asked to speak with Evelyn Barrett. He was well-dressed in the particular frontier manner that always made her think of a well-dressed snake: expensive hat, clean boots, silver watch chain, and a smile that worked very hard to reach his eyes and never quite made it. His name, he said, was Holloway. He was an associate of Mr. Cutter's. Evelyn stood in the doorway of the boarding house, one hand on the door frame, and felt the cold, quiet thing in her chest become very sharp. "I don't know any Mr. Cutter," she said. "Mr. Cutter believes you do," Holloway said pleasantly. "He believes you know him quite well, in fact. He would like to extend an invitation to discuss a matter of mutual interest." "I am not interested," Evelyn said. "Mrs. Barrett." Holloway's smile became something more specific, something with edges. "The matter involves your late husband's obligations. Mr. Cutter is a patient man, but patience has its limits. He suggests that a private conversation would be preferable to a public one, given the nature of the information he holds." She understood that immediately for what it was: a threat to expose Robert's crimes, and by extension her own connection to them, publicly, in a town where she was only barely beginning to build something. "Tell Mr. Cutter," Evelyn said, and she kept her voice completely level, "that if he has a legitimate claim, he is welcome to present it to the appropriate legal authority." Holloway looked at her for a moment with something that might have been surprise. Then he nodded, tipped his hat with a false courtesy that made her skin crawl, and walked away down Garrison Street. Evelyn closed the door. She stood in the hallway of her boarding house for a full 3 minutes, breathing carefully, letting the cold shock pass through her and settle. She was going to have to tell Samuel Hadley. The recognition arrived with the same inevitability as a stone dropping to the bottom of still water. She did not want to. Every instinct she had developed in the 14 months since Robert's death, every carefully constructed layer of distance and self-sufficiency, screamed at her to handle it herself, to find another way, to not put herself in the position of revealing her history to a lawman who might feel obligated to act on it in ways she could not control. But Vance Cutter was not a problem she could manage alone in a frontier town with no resources beyond a boarding house full of transient cattle drovers and the goodwill of the Caldwell Ladies' Society. She waited until that evening, until supper was cleared and Gerald Hobbs had retreated to his room, and Pete Dawson had gone to his weekly card game at the feed store, and the house was quiet. She knocked on Samuel's door. He opened it promptly, still in his work clothes, his expression moving through the usual sequence of neutral recognition and into something attentive when he saw whatever was on her face. "Can I speak with you?" she said. "Of course." He stepped back to let her in, which was not exactly the done thing, and they both knew it, but the parlor had a crack in the door that let sound carry, and she did not want this overheard. She sat in the chair by the window. He sat on the edge of the bed with his forearms on his knees, the exact posture she had seen him in at the kitchen table at 1 in the morning, the posture of a man who was entirely present and entirely calm. She told him, all of it. The 17 letters, Robert's fraud, the homesteaders who had lost their land, the bank's collapse, Cincinnati, Vance Cutter appearing at her door with his claim, her flight west, the forged letter of introduction, the boarding house, all of it, everything she had been carrying in the locked chest of her chest since she had packed those 2 trunks and boarded the westbound train. She spoke for a long time, and he did not interrupt her once. When she finished, the room was very quiet. The evening sounds of the street drifted through the closed window, horses and voices and the distant music from one of the saloons, all of it absurdly normal against the wreckage she had just laid between them. Samuel Hadley looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been carrying this alone?" 14 months, she said. "More or less." He exhaled slowly. Not a sigh exactly, something more considered. "Cutter's been operating out of the territory for about 6 months," he said. We have been building a case against him. The fraud is extensive, Mrs. Barrett, not just what your husband was involved in. He has been running land deed forgeries independently for years, using men like your husband as a layer of insulation. He paused. What he told you about the debt, the personal loan to your husband, I want to see whatever documentation he is claiming. He has not shown me any. He won't, because it almost certainly does not exist. Samuel's voice was steady and certain in the way that only comes from having dealt with men like Vance Cutter before and knowing their methods. He is using the threat of exposure to control you. The claim is likely fabricated entirely. He sees a woman in a vulnerable position, and he is using your fear of what your husband did as a lever. Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched so long she had forgotten what it felt like unclenched. "You are certain," she said. "Not without seeing his supposed documentation, but I know his pattern." He looked at her directly. "You should have come to me sooner." "I did not know if I could trust you," she said, which was the honest answer and a harder one to say than it looked. Something moved through his expression that was not quite hurt and not quite understanding, but somewhere in the complicated territory between them. "That is fair," he said quietly. "I did not know what you would do with the information about Robert. What he did is not your crime, Mrs. Barrett. That is not how the law always operates," she said. "I am aware of how the law sometimes operates. It is not how I operate." He held her gaze for a moment. "You are safe here. Your position at this boarding house is legitimate and your work has been honest. Whatever Robert Barrett did, you did not do it." She looked at him, this man who had been sitting at her breakfast table for 3 months, who had noticed she was not sleeping and brought in extra firewood and left books in doorways, and she felt something so sudden and so enormous move through her that she had to look away. "Thank you," she said, to the window. "I am going to need you to let me handle Cutter," he said. "If he sends anyone else to you or approaches you directly, I need you to tell me immediately. Do not meet with him, do not correspond with him, and do not let him frighten you into anything." "He is not going to frighten me into anything," she said, looking back at him. "I stopped being frightened of men like him somewhere around the time I realized I had no one left to lose." The words came out with more rawness than she had intended. Samuel heard it. She could see him hear it. The way his expression shifted into something careful, and careful did not mean distant. It meant the precise opposite. It meant the kind of attention that holds rather than dismisses. "You are going to be all right," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she stood, smoothed her skirts, and went back to her own room. She lay awake for a long time listening to the ordinary sounds of a Kansas summer night, and thinking about the fact that she had just told Samuel Hadley every single secret she had, and the world had not ended. What she had not told him was that somewhere in the 3 months since she had arrived at this boarding house, she had started to feel things she had not expected to feel again. What she had not told him was that the sight of him at the breakfast table had become the anchor of her mornings, that she had started listening for his footstep on the stairs, that she caught herself thinking about things he had said at odd moments throughout the day with a frequency that she recognized and refused to name. She was not ready for any of that. She knew she was not ready. She just wished she had more control over the speed at which she was becoming ready. Samuel moved against Cutter carefully and methodically over the following 2 weeks, in the quiet, systematic way that characterized everything he did. He made contact with a federal marshal's office in Wichita that had been building its own file on Cutter's land fraud operation. He gathered testimony from 2 of the homesteaders in Caldwell who had been defrauded through dealings that could be tied back to Cutter's network. He did all of this without fanfare, without discussion at supper, without giving any indication to the outside world that the net was tightening. But he told Evelyn. Not everything, and not in detail that would put her in danger, but enough that she knew the shape of what was happening, and she understood that his telling her was a form of trust that he was extending deliberately. She thought about that a great deal. Cutter himself appeared in Caldwell on a Thursday morning in the last week of June. Evelyn saw him from the front window of the boarding house, crossing the main street toward the bank with two men she did not know but whose posture said everything that needed saying about their professional function. He was older than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply seeing him more clearly now, and the particular quality of his smile, even from across the street, made the hair on the back of her neck rise. She told Samuel that evening. He received the information with the focused calm of a man who had been expecting it. "He is here to put pressure on the land deal negotiations," Samuel said. "We have been interfering with his ability to move stolen deed titles through the county recorder's office. He has come to resolve the problem personally." "Is that dangerous?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "He is not going to come anywhere near you," he said. "I have made it clear through appropriate channels that any approach to you will be treated as witness intimidation." "I am not a witness." "You are a material witness to his methods, if not his specific crimes in this territory." His expression was matter-of-fact, but there was an edge underneath it that she recognized as anger, quiet and controlled. "He is not going to use you as leverage. I won't allow it." The certainty in his voice was so absolute that she felt it physically, as a warmth in the center of her chest that she had no idea what to do with. "You do not have to protect me," she said. "I know I do not have to," he said. "That is not why I am doing it." She looked at him across the table where they had been sitting, a half-drunk cup of coffee between them, the evening light coming sideways through the kitchen window, and the world became very still for a moment. She thought, "I know exactly what that means." And she thought, "I am not ready to say it out loud yet." She said, "Thank you, Samuel." It was the first time she had used his given name. She had not planned it, it just came out. He was very still for just a moment. Then he said, "You are welcome, Evelyn." The tension that had been building between them for 3 months did what tension does when it reaches a certain temperature. It changed state. They were not different with each other the next morning at breakfast. They were exactly the same, polite and considerate and professionally appropriate, because they were both people who had spent years learning the discipline of not wanting things too loudly in front of other people. But the air between them had a different quality, charged and aware, and she suspected he felt it as clearly as she did. The resolution with Cutter came on a Friday in early July, suddenly and decisively, the way these things often do when they have been building quietly for months. The federal marshals arrived from Wichita with the warrants that Samuel had helped them build, arrested Vance Cutter at the hotel where he was staying, and took into custody both the men who had been traveling with him. The charges included land fraud, document forgery, and intimidation of witnesses, and the evidence was extensive enough that the case was described to Evelyn, in the brief, factual summary Samuel gave her that evening, as solid. She sat with that information for a moment. "Is it over?" she said. "For Cutter, yes," he said. "He will not be coming back to Caldwell." She thought about the 17 letters. She thought about Robert's study in Cincinnati, the respectable desk and the respectable suits and the catastrophic secret underneath all of it. She thought about 14 months of carrying something so heavy she had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "What about me?" she said. "The debt claim." "There is no legitimate debt," Samuel said. "I confirmed it with the federal marshals. Cutter had no documented financial arrangement with your husband. The claim was entirely manufactured to control you." He paused. "You owe him nothing. You never did." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to apologize." "For what?" "For not trusting you sooner." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You had every reason not to trust. The history that brought you here was a history of being failed by people you trusted." He looked at her steadily. "I did not take it personally." "You should have a little," she said. "You deserved better than my suspicion." Something in his expression shifted, the careful control loosening just slightly at the edges, enough to show the warmth that lived underneath it. "You are being very generous to me," he said. "I am being accurate," she said. And then, because she had been thinking it for 3 months, and the relief of the day, and the warmth of the kitchen, and the particular quality of the light, had lowered her defenses below the level she maintained by conscious effort, she said, "Samuel, I think you should know that what I feel toward you has not been entirely gratitude for some time." The room was absolutely quiet. She watched his expression change, slowly and fully, the way dawn changes a dark field, not all at once but in incremental brightening that eventually becomes undeniable. "Evelyn," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality that made her throat tighten. "You do not have to say anything," she said quickly. "I'm not asking you for anything. I simply wanted you to know." "I want to say something," he said. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, his forearms on the table, his brown eyes direct and serious and warm. "What I feel toward you has not been entirely professional for quite some time either." She looked at him. She thought, "Then why are we still sitting on opposite sides of this table?" She thought, "Because we are both frightened people who have been hurt, and being frightened and being brave about it are not mutually exclusive, and sometimes the bravest thing is to say the truth and wait." She said, "Then perhaps we should do something about that." He was quiet for a moment. Something crossed his face that was complex and serious, not reluctance exactly, but the expression of a man taking something seriously that deserves to be taken seriously. "You have been through an enormous amount," he said, "in a short period of time. The fraud, the move, Cutter, all of it. You are just now in a position where the immediate pressure is gone." He looked at her carefully. "I do not want you to confuse relief with something else. And I do not want to move in a direction that you will feel differently about in a month when everything has settled." The words landed with a specific precision that she recognized as genuine care and which also made her want to overturn the coffee cups. "Are you saying that you think I do not know my own mind?" she said. "I am saying that I care enough about your mind to want to be certain of it," he said. "Both of our minds." He held her gaze. "Ask me again when you are ready." She stared at him. 6 words. 6 words that were either the most considerate thing anyone had ever said to her, or the most maddening, and she genuinely could not decide which. And the fact that she could not decide told her something significant about the state of her heart. She said good night with all the dignity she could assemble. She walked back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in the warm July dark, and she replayed those 6 words approximately 47 times. "Ask me again when you are ready." The presupposition in them was staggering, she realized. He was not saying no. He was not saying he did not feel what she felt. He was saying, "Yes, but not yet, not until you are certain, not until the dust from everything that brought you here has settled enough that you can look at this clearly." He was saying, "You matter too much to me to risk getting this wrong because we moved too fast." She thought about the day he had sat across from her in the dark kitchen at 1 in the morning and asked what she was actually afraid of. She thought about the books left in doorways and the extra firewood, and the way he had said, "I know I do not have to. That is not why I am doing it." She thought, "This man has been in love with me for months, and he is patient enough to wait until he is certain I am ready because he would rather wait and be sure than rush and be careless with something that matters." She thought, "I have been ready for longer than I have admitted." She got up. She put her boots back on. She walked downstairs. The fire in the sitting room had burned down to embers, but they were generous embers, throwing a warm orange light across the worn rug and the 2 chairs that faced each other across the hearth. Samuel was sitting in one of them. He had a book open on his knee, but he was not reading it. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She crossed the room. She sat in the chair across from him. The firelight moved across both their faces, and the house was completely quiet around them, and outside the Kansas night was warm and dark and full of the sound of crickets. She looked at him across the glow of the embers. "I am ready," she said. He was very still. "You spent 3 months watching a woman you barely knew navigate a crisis she should never have been left to navigate alone," she said, and her voice was steady. She was proud of it. "And in all that time, you were patient and decent and honest, and you told me the truth even when it would have been easier to manage me with half of it. And you have been the single most reliable person in my life since I arrived in this town, which is a low bar, admittedly, but you have exceeded it by a significant distance." She paused. "I know my own mind, Samuel. I have known it for some time. I was afraid to say so because the last time I trusted what I knew, I was catastrophically wrong. But I am not wrong about this." The fire crackled softly. He was watching her with an expression she could not entirely name, something between wonder and recognition, as though he were seeing something he had been quietly hoping for and had been careful not to expect. "You asked me again," he said quietly. "You told me to," she said. Something moved across his face that was the slow, undeniable warmth of a man who has been waiting for something, and has finally, carefully, allowed himself to believe it is real. He leaned forward in his chair, and she leaned forward in hers, and across the warm space between them, with the dying fire at their feet and the July night around them and the whole dark, quiet house above them, he reached out and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her deliberately. His hand was warm and large and completely certain, and she felt the touch from her fingers all the way to the center of her chest. "I have been very carefully not falling in love with you," he said. "And I have been doing a terrible job of it." She laughed, which surprised her, a real laugh, not the polite social sound she had been producing for 14 months, but an actual laugh that came from somewhere genuine. He smiled when she laughed, and the smile transformed his face in a way she had seen only rarely, the full opening of an expression that was usually carefully curated. "I should tell you," he said, "that I intend to do this properly, whatever that means to you." "It means considerable conversation," she said. "I am prepared for considerable conversation," he said. "And patience," she said. "There are things I am still working through. Things about trusting and believing and not being afraid every time something good happens." "I know," he said. "I have a few of those myself." She looked at him. "Texas," she said. A pause. "Yes," he said. "Texas. Sometime I will tell you about Texas." "Not tonight," she said. "Not tonight," he agreed. He looked down at their joined hands for a moment, then back up at her. "Tonight I am just going to be very glad that you came back downstairs." She was very glad, too. She did not say it yet. But she held his hand in the firelight and let herself feel it, the warmth and the rightness and the extraordinary, terrifying, extraordinary relief of being known by someone and not destroyed by it. The summer moved forward with the particular momentum that comes when two people have spoken the truth and are figuring out what to do with it. It was not simple. Nothing worth having ever was, and both Evelyn and Samuel were people who had learned that particular lesson in hard ways. They talked. That was the shape of what they built in those first weeks after the fire, which was not what the romanticists of the day might have imagined. Not stolen kisses in supply closets or dramatic declarations across crowded rooms, but conversation, long and serious, and sometimes difficult conversation about who they were and what had made them that way. He told her about Texas on a Sunday afternoon in late July, sitting on the back porch of the boarding house in the shade of the overhang, while the heat pressed down on the town beyond them. He had grown up on a cattle ranch outside of San Antonio, third of 4 children, with a father who worked himself to exhaustion and a mother who died when Samuel was 14 of a fever that a doctor in a larger town might have caught in time. The ranch had failed when he was 19. The combination of drought and a dishonest deal with a cattle buyer who had ties to people powerful enough to make disputing it dangerous. His father had died 2 years later, not dramatically but in the slow, diminishing way that men sometimes die when everything they built has been taken from them, and they cannot find a reason to rebuild. Samuel had left Texas at 21 and spent 3 years working his way north, ranching and then freight hauling, and then, through a series of circumstances he described with the economy of someone who has told a story enough times to have stripped it down to its essential facts, he had ended up deputized in a small Oklahoma town under a federal marshal named Garrett who had seen something in him worth developing. He had been a lawman since. "You came to the law because of what happened to your father," Evelyn said. "Partly," he said. "Partly because I was good at it, partly because I needed a reason to keep moving. He looked at his hands, broad and still in his lap. When you stop moving, you have to live with what you are, and for a long time what I was did not seem like much. She looked at him. And now, she said. He met her eyes. Now I am less concerned with moving, he said. She thought, this man knows exactly what he is saying at all times and chooses his words with the same precision he applies to everything else, and the deliberateness of it is perhaps the most trustworthy thing about him. She reached over and put her hand over his, and they sat on the back porch in the July shade and watched a hawk circle lazily over the flat land beyond the town's edge. August arrived, and with it, a development that Evelyn had not anticipated. She was happy. Not the careful, cautious approximation of stability that she had been building since March, but actual, specific happiness, the kind that ambushes you in ordinary moments. Standing at the kitchen stove at dawn with the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving in the room above, or walking back from the market, and seeing through the window of the boarding house the reading lamp lit in the sitting room and knowing who was sitting under it. It was terrifying, being happy. She had not expected that. She had thought that happiness would feel like relief, like the lifting of something heavy. Instead, it felt like vulnerability, the sense of having something to lose again, which she recognized as the same feeling that had undone her once before. She talked to Samuel about it one evening, haltingly, because it was not an easy thing to explain, the way grief had trained her to distrust joy. He listened to all of it without rushing her toward a resolution. Then he said, "What would it look like to let yourself have this without waiting for it to be taken?" She thought about that for a long time. "I think it would look like this," she said finally. "Right now, this conversation." He looked at her for a moment. Then he took her hand, deliberately, the way he always did things, with full intention. "Then let it be this," he said. Martha Greer noticed. Of course Martha Greer noticed, because Martha Greer could identify the emotional weather patterns of everyone within a 3-block radius of the Ladies' Society Hall without even trying. She said nothing directly, because Martha operated through strategic indirection, but she invited both Evelyn and Samuel to a Sunday supper at the same time and watched them interact with the barely concealed satisfaction of a chess player who has successfully positioned the board. Afterward, walking back to the boarding house through the warm August evening, Samuel said, "Was that as deliberate as I think it was?" "Almost certainly more so," Evelyn said. "Martha Greer does nothing by accident. Should I be concerned?" "Only if you object to being approved of," she said. He considered this. "I don't object to it," he said, "particularly from people who matter to you." She looked up at him, walking beside her in the dusty evening, tall and unhurried and real, and she thought, when did this become the thing I arrange my life around? And then she thought, probably somewhere around the kitchen table at 1 in the morning, honestly. September brought the winding down of cattle season and a quieter Caldwell, the population contracting as the drovers headed south and the summer money moved on. The boarding house reduced to 5 tenants, and Evelyn had more hours in the day, which she found initially disorienting after the brutal pace of the summer, and then gradually began to appreciate. She had started writing. Not the careful accounting records she had always maintained, but actual writing, letters to the families of the homesteaders who had been defrauded through her husband's dealings. She had gotten the names from the federal marshal's records, which Samuel had helped her access through the appropriate channels, and she had written to each family individually, not with excuses or explanations, but with an acknowledgement of what had been done and a genuine apology for the role, however ignorant, that her position as Robert's wife had played. She did not expect responses. She sent the letters anyway, because it was the right thing to do, and because she was trying very hard to be a person who did the right thing even when there was no immediate benefit. She told Samuel what she was doing. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That takes considerable courage." "It takes a pen and paper," she said. "That is not what I mean, and you know it," he said. She did know it. "It felt necessary," she said. I cannot change what he did, but I can refuse to be entirely separate from the consequences." He looked at her for a long time with an expression that made her feel seen in the particular, specific way that his looking had always done. From the very first morning she had walked into the dining room with a pot of oatmeal and met his quiet, attentive eyes. "Evelyn," he said, "yes, I am very much in love with you." The words were simple and direct in the way that he was, without ornament or strategy, just the true thing said plainly. She felt them like sunlight through a window that had been kept shut. "I know," she said. "I am very much in love with you too." He crossed the room and kissed her for the first time, his hand against her face, careful and certain, the two qualities that defined everything about him, and she kissed him back and thought, 14 months ago my world ended, and I did not know it was clearing the ground for something to grow. October in Caldwell was a different thing entirely from the roaring summer months, cooler and quieter, and possessed of a beauty that the blazing heat had not allowed. The prairie went gold and rust at the edges, and the sky became the particular deep blue that only autumn produces, and the boarding house with its 5 tenants and its clean rooms and its reliable meals had become exactly what Evelyn had intended it to be. A thing she had built with her own hands that could not be taken from her. Samuel had been discussing with the federal marshal's office the possibility of a promotion. The position of senior deputy marshal for the Caldwell district had opened, which would mean more responsibility and a more permanent posting, no more assignments that might pull him elsewhere in the territory. He mentioned it to Evelyn with the specific care of a man who understands that the decision is connected to something larger than his own career. "Would you want to stay in Caldwell?" she said. "I would want to stay where you are," he said, "if you will have me." She looked at him. "You are being very careful again," she said. "Occupational habit," he said. "Samuel." "Yes, ask me," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he said, "Evelyn Barrett, will you marry me?" She had been waiting for it, and it still hit her like something bright and sudden. She thought about all the reasons she had catalogued against trusting, against hoping, against allowing another person into the interior of her life where they could reach the things that mattered. She thought about every one of those reasons clearly and specifically, and then she set them down. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He exhaled as though he had been holding his breath and not entirely realized it. She stepped forward into him and he wrapped both arms around her, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat, which was faster than his composed exterior would suggest, and she laughed. "Were you nervous?" she said, muffled against his shirt. "Considerably," he said. "You did not look nervous." "I was raised to believe that looking nervous and being nervous were separate and distinct problems," he said, "and that a man could control one even when he could not control the other." "That sounds like an exhausting way to live," she said. "It really is," he agreed. She laughed again, and he held her while she laughed, and the October light came through the sitting room window, and the fire crackled, and the boarding house that she had built was entirely quiet around them. They were married in December of 1882. It was a small ceremony, because neither of them wanted a large one, and because their version of celebrating was sitting across a table from people who mattered and being honest with them, which was not a capacity available in very large groups. Martha Greer cried, which everyone present agreed not to mention because Martha had a reputation to maintain. Gerald Hobbs could not hear most of the vows but applauded enthusiastically at what he interpreted as the appropriate moments. Pete Dawson wept openly, without apparent self-consciousness. The federal marshal's office confirmed Samuel's promotion in January, which meant a small increase in salary and a larger, permanent office at the end of Garrison Street that also had a back room suitable for storage, or, as Evelyn immediately began calculating, for an expansion of the boarding house's provisioning operation if they could negotiate the lease on the adjacent lot. They were, both of them, deeply practical people. The romance of their daily life was not theatrical. It was a cup of coffee on the table before she asked for it. It was a lamp kept burning when he was working late. It was the way he knocked twice before opening any door she might be behind. It was the way she kept a book he had mentioned wanting on the corner of his desk where he would find it. It was ordinary life conducted with the specific attention of people who understood what it meant to live without such attention and had decided never to take it for granted. She received 3 responses to the letter he had sent to the Homesteader families. 2 of them were cautious acknowledgments, polite but reserved, from people understandably unwilling to extend warmth toward the widow of the man who had defrauded them. The third was from a woman in southern Kansas named Clara Marsh, whose husband had lost their farm through Robert's machinations in 1876, and who wrote back with a long, extraordinary letter that began with anger and moved through it, and arrived somewhere that Evelyn could only call the careful beginning of generosity. They began corresponding. It became, over the following year, one of the more meaningful relationships of Evelyn's life. This friendship conducted entirely through letters with a woman she had never met, who had every reason to hate her and who had chosen instead to extend the much harder, braver option. Evelyn showed one of Clara's letters to Samuel one evening. He read it carefully as he read everything, and then he handed it back and said, "She is remarkable." "She is," Evelyn said. "I think courage must come more naturally to some people. It does not come naturally to anyone," he said. "That is why it is courage." She thought about that for a long time. By the spring of 1883, Evelyn was pregnant. She discovered it on a morning in late March when the confirmation of what she had been quietly suspecting made the kitchen tilt slightly on its axis, and she had to sit down very fast in the nearest chair. She told Samuel that evening, directly, without preface, because she was not a woman who managed information or softened things unnecessarily when the thing itself was enough. The expression that crossed his face was something she had not seen before. Not the controlled, considered warmth of his usual register, but something rower and wider and more completely unguarded than she had ever seen him allow. Something that was entirely joy and entirely terrified simultaneously. The particular combination that she thought was probably the most honest response available. He sat down across from her and covered both her hands with his, and they sat for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people absorbing something that changes the shape of every future thing. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am extraordinary," she said. And then, because honesty was the foundation of everything they had built, and frightened, both at once. "Both at once," he agreed and pressed her hands gently. "We are very good at both at once." The pregnancy was not difficult, but it was not effortless either, and Evelyn approached it the way she approached everything, with practical attention and a refusal to be undone by what she could not control. Samuel was attentive without being fretful, which she appreciated enormously, the distinction being that attentive meant present and responsive, while fretful meant hovering in a way that would have made her feel managed rather than loved. He handled the additional load at the boarding house without complaint and without making a point of it. He fixed a second chair in their sitting room to a better angle so she could rest her feet. He came home from the market one afternoon with a book on the physiology of pregnancy that she knew perfectly well he had ordered from the bookseller in Wichita 3 weeks earlier, and he handed it to her with the air of someone presenting a completely casual and spontaneous gift. And she loved him so thoroughly in that moment that she had to turn away to compose herself. She wrote to Clara Marsh about the pregnancy and received back a letter of such warm delight that she cried, which she had not expected, and which she decided to attribute to the pregnancy, and not to the simple, profound reality of being cared for by someone who owed her nothing and gave the care anyway. Their son was born in November of 1883, on a cold, clear night with the stars spread across the Kansas sky in extravagant numbers, as though the world had decided to mark the occasion with something large. He was healthy and substantial and possessed of an immediately evident opinion about the discomforts of the world beyond the womb, which he expressed at volume. They named him James, after Samuel's father. Samuel held his son for the first time with the hands that had always known exactly what to do with everything, and they were not steady. They were not steady at all, and he did not try to make them so. And Evelyn watched this man she loved hold their son and cry without any attempt to manage it, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone trusts you with the real version of themselves. James Samuel Hadley was a loud, determined, astonishingly opinionated infant who grew into a loud, determined, astonishingly opinionated toddler with his father's dark eyes, and his mother's absolute certainty that his assessment of any given situation was correct. The boarding house expanded. They did negotiate the lease on the adjacent lot, and the addition they built in the spring of 1884 added 4 rooms and a proper dining room, making the Hadley boarding house, as it had become known by that point, the finest of its kind in Caldwell. Martha Greer attended the opening of the expansion and toured every room with the expression of a general reviewing a successful campaign. "You should be proud of this," Martha said. "We are," Evelyn said, and meant the we specifically and deliberately. Caldwell itself was changing. The cattle trade continued its slow shift, and the town was adapting, as frontier towns do when the original economic engine that created them begins to sputter. Some establishments closed, others evolved. The Hadley boarding house evolved with the town, shifting from accommodating primarily trail drovers to catering to the merchants and traveling businessmen who were beginning to replace them as the central economic activity of the region. Samuel's work evolved too. The kinds of crime that occupied his attention in 1884 were different from the direct, physical frontier crime of 1882. There was more complexity now, more paperwork, more coordination with courts and federal agencies, which suited him in some ways and frustrated him in others. He talked about it honestly, in the evenings when James was asleep and the boarding house was quiet, the particular frustration of a man who had come to the law out of a conviction that it should protect people, and who regularly encountered the gap between that conviction and the institutional reality. Evelyn listened. She offered perspective when she had it and silence when she did not, which was its own kind of response, and one he had told her he valued. In the summer of 1885, Clara Marsh finally made the trip to Caldwell. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon in July, a stocky, gray-eyed woman in her mid-40s with an expression of considerable wariness and a handshake that was firmer than most men's. And she stood in the front parlor of the boarding house looking at Evelyn with the particular expression of someone who has built up an elaborate internal picture of a person and is now comparing it to the reality. "You are younger than I imagined," Clara said. "You are exactly as I imagined," Evelyn said, which was true. They had 3 days together, and they talked for approximately 2 of them, with breaks for sleep and meals. Conversation ranging across everything from the practical details of the land fraud that had taken Clara's farm to the philosophical questions of responsibility and inheritance, and the particular burdens placed on women by the institutions that were supposed to protect them. Samuel, who was a man who understood when he was not the most important person in a given room, made himself genuinely helpful and generally absent with the grace that distinguished him. On the last evening of Clara's visit, the 2 women sat on the back porch while James toddled around in the small fenced yard under Samuel's watchful eye, and Clara said, "You are not what Robert Barrett deserved." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "I do not think about him very much anymore," she said. "I used to think about him constantly, what he did, why, what it meant about everything I thought I knew. Now I mostly think about this." She gestured at the yard, at James, at the warm summer evening, at the life assembled around her. "I think the best use of what he did to me is to not let it be the most important thing." Clara looked at her. "That is considerable wisdom," she said. "It took considerable time," Evelyn said. They embraced when Clara left, and it was the embrace of women who have built something genuine out of materials that were initially unpromising, and Evelyn stood on the porch and watched the stagecoach carry her friend back towards southern Kansas, and felt the particular fullness that comes from a life that has more in it than fear. The spring of 1886 arrived with new growth in every sense. James was 2.5, fully mobile, fully verbal, and maintaining a consistent program of attempting to reorganize the boarding house according to principles that were entirely his own and completely opaque to anyone else. He had developed a particular attachment to Samuel's deputy's badge, which he referred to as the shiny, and Samuel had taken to keeping a spare polished coin in his pocket specifically for the purpose of offering a substitute. Evelyn was pregnant again. They discovered this in February and received it this time with less shock and more immediate, straightforward joy, the fear not absent but smaller, reduced by the evidence of James's solid, vocal, opinionated existence. "Possibly a girl this time," Evelyn said one evening, not making a request of the universe, just considering the range of possibilities. "Possibly," Samuel said. "Though our son has given me reason to believe that the Hadley children will have opinions regardless of the category." "Your Hadley children," she said. "Our Hadley children," he said, "though the opinions are clearly from your side." "My opinions are considered and well-reasoned," she said. "They absolutely are," he said. "James's are also considered and well-reasoned. He just reasons from the position that the biscuit should be retrieved from the floor and returned to the plate because floors are for walking, not for biscuits." "He has a point," Evelyn said. "He has 17 points, all simultaneously," Samuel said. "I do not know where he gets it." She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it because of course he did, and he grinned at her, the full open grin that she had spent the better part of a year earning the right to see regularly. And she thought, "I walked into this town with 2 trunks and a forged letter, and I was so completely certain that everything good was behind me, and I was so completely wrong." The second child was a girl, born in October of 1886, delivered on a blustery Kansas morning, with the wind working hard at the windows and James conducting a loud investigation of the door from the other side, while the midwife made pointed requests for quiet. They named her Ruth Margaret Hadley, Margaret for Evelyn's mother who had died when Evelyn was 12. Ruth was smaller than James had been and quieter, but the quietness was observational rather than passive, the specific quiet of a person who is paying very close attention to everything around her, which Samuel recognized with a particular expression of tender amusement because it was, Evelyn informed him, the exact quality that made him simultaneously excellent and exasperating. James received his sister with the complicated mixture of excitement and suspicion that characterized his general approach to any significant alteration in the established order. He brought her gifts of his most prized possessions over the following weeks, placing them solemnly in the corner of her basket, until the basket contained 2 smooth stones, a length of red ribbon he had found in the yard, and the polished coin Samuel had given him as a substitute for the deputy's badge. Evelyn watched this process with the full weight of a heart that had not expected to be this large. They celebrated the new year of 1887 with a supper that ran until late, Gerald Hobbs having finally been convinced by James's enthusiastic intervention to stay up past his usual 8 o'clock, and Pete Dawson's new wife having joined the circle, a pleasant young woman named Agnes who sold millinery goods, and who had taken an instant and apparently permanent liking to Ruth's penchant for solemn, evaluative staring. The federal marshal came to Caldwell in February with an offer for Samuel, a position in Wichita as a senior marshal with significantly expanded authority, and a salary increase substantial enough to be genuinely meaningful. Samuel brought it home and told Evelyn about it that same evening, sitting at the kitchen table with James asleep and Ruth sleeping in her basket by the stove, and he laid out the details with the clarity and precision that characterized the way he shared everything important. Then he said, "What do you think?" She considered it carefully, which he had always allowed her to do, the space to think without rushing her toward a conclusion. She thought about the boarding house, which was genuinely hers in a way that few things in her life had ever been. She thought about Martha Greer and Clara's letters, and the particular quality of a life built in a specific place. She thought about what it would mean to move, to start over, to rebuild in a new town. Then she thought about what a life built around a person was worth, and about the direction in which the word home had gradually oriented itself over the past 5 years. "Is it something you want?" she said. "It would allow me to do more good," he said. "At a larger scale. It is work I believe in." He looked at her steadily. "But I would not take it in a way that cost you something you have built." "What I have built is not a building," she said. "I know that now." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "We can build a new boarding house in Wichita. I have done it before." He looked at her with the full, serious warmth she had come to understand was the most honest expression his face made. "Are you certain?" "Samuel," she said, "I know my own mind." He remembered. She could see that he remembered the sitting room in July of 1882, the fire, her voice saying, "I know my own mind. I have known it for some time." He looked at her across the kitchen table in February of 1887, with their 2 children asleep around them and the boarding house quiet above them, and he said, "Yes, you always have." They moved to Wichita in April. Martha Greer organized the departure with the efficiency she applied to all things, including a proper farewell supper that she insisted was not a farewell, because Caldwell was only a reasonable distance by rail and regular visits were fully expected and would be enforced. Evelyn embraced her at the door of the Ladies' Society Hall and felt the small, solid reality of this woman who had handed her a lifeline in March of 1882, without knowing whether she was throwing it to someone worth saving. "You were worth saving," Martha said quietly, as though she had heard the thought, which Evelyn put past her because Martha Greer quite possibly could. Gerald Hobbs shook her hand at length and then shook it again, because he had not been certain the first time that the moment had fully registered. Pete Dawson and Agnes attended the station with a basket of food for the journey, and what appeared to be the beginning of a great deal of emotion that Pete was managing with familiar lack of self-consciousness. The train pulled out of Caldwell on a clear April morning, with James's face pressed against the window, narrating everything he saw in the earnest, detailed manner of a 3-year-old, who has decided the world requires his commentary, and Ruth, regarding the passing scenery with her characteristic thoughtful quiet, and Samuel's hand covering Evelyn's on the seat between them. She looked out the window at the flat Kansas land unreeling past, brown and gold and green in the April light, and she thought about a woman who had arrived in this territory with 2 trunks and a forged letter, and so much fear she could barely breathe, and she thought about everything that fear had been cleared away to make room for. Wichita was larger than Caldwell and louder and considerably more complex. A city in the process of becoming something specific rather than a frontier town in the process of surviving. Samuel threw himself into his new position with the focused energy of a man who has found the level at which his abilities are fully engaged, and Evelyn threw herself into the project of building again. The boarding house in Wichita came together in the fall of 1887, a larger establishment than the Caldwell house, with 8 rooms and a proper dining room, and a kitchen that Evelyn designed herself with the experience of 5 years of cooking for paying guests, informing every decision. She named it the Hadley house, which Samuel said was redundant since people would have figured out whose it was, and she said that was precisely the point. Ruth began walking in October, in the particular determined, wide-legged way of very serious people learning a new skill, and James received this development as a general expansion of available companions, which led to a period of intense negotiation about the terms under which Ruth would participate in various activities, negotiations that Ruth conducted from her position of being 14 months old entirely through the medium of expression and the strategic deployment of tears. They were an excellent match. The years that followed settled into the particular rhythm of a life that is genuinely good, which does not mean without difficulty, because no life is, but which has at its center a foundation solid enough that difficulties can be weathered without becoming catastrophes. Samuel's work was demanding and occasionally dangerous, never entirely free from the realities of frontier law in a changing West, but he came home, and he told her about it, and she listened, and they talked, and they continued to be the kind of people to each other that they had been from the beginning, which was present and honest and paying attention. Clara Marsh visited Wichita in 1889 and stayed for a week. She met Ruth, who regarded her with the solemn evaluation she applied to all new people, and James, who immediately began showing her things and explaining them at length, and Samuel, who shook her hand with the respect due someone who had given Evelyn something irreplaceable. Clara walked through the boarding house on the first morning and looked at the dining room and the kitchen and the clean, well-run ordinariness of everything, and she said, very quietly, "This is what it should always have been." "Yes," Evelyn said, "it is." In 1890, Samuel was offered a position in Washington, an advisory role with the Justice Department on federal marshal operations across the Western Territories. He brought it home and they talked about it for 3 evenings, going through it from every angle, and in the end the answer was no, not because the work was not meaningful, but because Washington was not the West and they were both, at their cores, people who needed the particular honesty of a sky you could see all the way to the horizon. He turned it down without regret, which told her something true about who he was. James started school in 1890, which he approached with the same earnest enthusiasm he applied to everything, and which produced, within 3 weeks, a teacher who was simultaneously delighted by his participation and slightly overwhelmed by its volume. Ruth watched him go every morning from the porch, with the expression of someone taking detailed notes for future reference. The 90s arrived and Caldwell's cattle trade finally wound down entirely, as the East had been winding toward for years. But by then Caldwell was something different, a settled town rather than a boomtown, and the Hadley boarding house in Wichita was fully established and profitable and largely ran itself, which allowed Evelyn to expand into a second project she had been considering for some time. She began working with the Wichita Women's Charitable Association on a program for women arriving in the city in difficult circumstances, which meant she was, in a specific and deliberate way, doing for other women what Martha Greer had once done for her. She told Samuel about it before she committed to it, and he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Of course. How can I help?" She told him and he helped, and they organized the thing together, which was how they approached most things, in the partnership that had been built slowly and carefully from a kitchen table, and a fire and 6 words that had once made her want to throw something, and which she had come to understand were the most honest form of love she had ever been offered. In 1892, a letter arrived from Martha Greer. Martha was in excellent health, she wished them to know, and Caldwell was doing very well, and Gerald Hobbs had finally agreed to move into the Ladies' Society's guest quarters, where the staff could monitor his tendency to forget meals. And Pete Dawson and Agnes were expecting their 3rd child, and the Ladies' Society had taken on 3 new members this year who were, Martha wrote, quite promising, although none of them were Evelyn, and that was a simple fact that could not be improved upon. Evelyn read this letter twice, and then put it in the box where she kept all of Martha's letters, which was a substantial box by now. James was 9 in 1892, and possessed of a focused intelligence that his teachers had begun describing in terms that suggested they were not entirely sure what category to put him in. He was interested in law, specifically, in the mechanisms by which order was maintained, and justice was distributed or failed to be, which Samuel received with the particular emotion of a man watching something he had built by example take root in someone he loved. Ruth was 6, and she had become more verbal with each passing year, The early quiet transformed not into loudness but into a precise, devastating eloquence that allowed her to end arguments with a single observation. She wanted to know how everything worked. She took clocks apart and, more impressively, put them back together. She asked questions that required Samuel to go find a book to answer them, and then asked follow-up questions about the book. "She is going to be extraordinary," Samuel said one evening. "She already is," Evelyn said. "So is he, both of them. How did that happen?" He looked at her across their bedroom, where the lamp was burning low and the house was quiet around them, their children asleep, the city of Wichita carrying on its ordinary business outside the window, and he said, "I have a theory." "Does it involve me?" she said. "It is primarily about you," he said, supplemented by the observation that extraordinary things tend to happen when a person refuses to let what has been done to them determine what they become. She looked at him. This man, this patient, deliberate, attentive, infuriating, entirely decent man. She thought about a boarding house in Caldwell and a dining room at 6:30 in the morning, and the question, "What are you actually afraid of?" and the fire and the 6 words and the hand held across the narrow kitchen table in the dark. "Come to bed, Samuel," she said. "Yes," he said. "Absolutely yes." They celebrated their 10th anniversary in December of 1892 with a supper that included James and Ruth and Agnes Dawson, who had made the trip from Caldwell with Pete, and their children specifically for the occasion, because Pete Dawson was constitutionally incapable of not being present for important events in the lives of people he loved. Martha Greer sent a letter that arrived the day before, as though she had calculated the postal timing to the hour, which Evelyn genuinely believed she had. Samuel made a toast, which was not something he did often, and it was brief, because that was who he was, and it was exactly right, because that was also who he was. He said, "To the woman who came back downstairs." She looked at him across the table full of people who mattered to her, her children and her friends and the life assembled around the fire she had started in 1882, and she thought about the word ready and what it had actually meant and what it had taken to get there. She raised her glass. "To the man who told me to ask again," she said. James looked between his parents with the expression of a 9-year-old who suspects there is a story he has not been told yet. Ruth watched with her characteristic careful attention, filing it away for later consideration. There would be time to tell the story. There would be many evenings of telling it over the years to come, the true version of it, the version that included the fear and the secrets and the fire and the 6 words, and the specific, particular courage it had taken to walk back into a room and say, "I am ready." They would tell it to their children, and their children would understand, in the way that children of honest parents do, that love was not a single moment but a series of chosen moments, each one built on the one before. The winter of 1892 settled over Wichita with its cold and its clarity, and the Hadley house stood solid on its street, its lights burning in the windows, its kitchen warm, its rooms full of the ordinary evidence of a life built carefully and honestly from materials that had seemed, at one particular dark moment, entirely insufficient. Evelyn Barrett Hadley sat beside the fire on a December evening with her husband's hand in hers and her daughter asleep against her side, and her son reading on the floor with the absorbed focus of a person who has found books are portals to everything. And she felt the fullness of it, not the absence of grief or difficulty or history, but the complete reality of a life that had room for all of those things and also for this, exactly this. She had arrived in Caldwell with nothing but her own determination and the thin, fierce belief that she could build something worth having. She had been right. It had just looked different from what she had imagined, better, more complicated, more demanding, more inhabited, more real. Samuel turned to look at her at some point in the quiet evening, sensing her attention the way he had always sensed it, that specific attentiveness to her that had terrified and sustained her by turns. "What are you thinking?" he said. She considered the question. She thought about everything it could encompass, every moment between the day she had arrived in this territory and this one, every fear she had overcome, and every wall she had dismantled, and every morning she had woken up and chosen to be the person she wanted to be rather than the person she was afraid of becoming. "I am thinking," she said, "that I am very glad you were patient." He looked at her for a moment with those quiet, attentive brown eyes. "I am thinking," he said, "that you were worth every moment of it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The fire burned. Ruth breathed her small, steady breaths beside her. James turned a page. Outside, the winter wind moved across the Kansas plains in the dark, and the stars above Wichita were exactly as numerous and as generous as they had been over Caldwell 10 years ago, on a July night when a woman who thought she was not ready had walked back downstairs and proved herself wrong. She had been ready. She had just needed someone patient enough to let her know it at her own pace, in her own time, in the way that only happens when love is offered not as a demand, but as a door left open, an invitation extended and repeated, a man's voice saying, "Ask me again when you are ready," and a woman's voice, that same night by the fire, saying that she was.